The house was quiet. Too quiet. I sat at the kitchen table, stirring my coffee absent-mindedly, watching the ceiling fan spin in slow, lazy circles. My wife, Sarah, had already left for another weekend trip with her friends, an arrangement that had become more routine than rare. Our conversations had dwindled to necessity. The occasional text, the obligatory goodnight. A marriage held together not by passion but by habit. Then came the call from Jake, my 20-year-old son. "Hey Dad. I'm bringing Nick home for the summer. Hope that's cool." Nick. The name sparked a memory, a vague recollection of a face I'd seen in pictures, in casual mentions over dinner when Jake still made the effort to talk about his life. But I hadn't paid attention then. Why would I? He was just a friend of my son's, another passing figure in the ever-changing orbit of Jake's social circle. "Of course," I replied, keeping my voice even. "I'll be here." The front door swung open a few hours later. Jake entered first, duffel bag slung over his shoulder, grinning like he always did when returning home after a long semester. And then, behind him, Nick stepped in. I was not prepared for Nick. Tall, confident, a presence that filled the room without effort. His dark hair was tousled like he'd just come from the beach. His shirt clung in just the right places, and when he smiled, casual, easy, something inside me shifted. "Mr. Callahan," he greeted, his voice smooth, carrying an edge of amusement. "Just Callahan," I corrected automatically. I didn't know why. His eyes lingered on me for half a second longer than they should have. And in that half-second, a silent current passed between us, unspoken, undeniable. Jake clapped him on the back. "Come on, man. I'll show you your room." I watched them disappear up the stairs, my fingers tightening around my coffee mug. The logical part of my brain tried to dismiss the moment as nothing, a trick of the mind, a misinterpretation. But deep down, I already knew better. That evening, I stood at the grill, flipping steaks while the setting sun painted the sky in warm hues. Jake and Nick sat at the patio table, laughing over some inside joke. I stole glances at Nick when I thought he wasn't looking. The sharp jawline, the casual way he leaned back in his chair, arms stretched behind his head, exuding a confidence I barely remembered possessing at his age. Then, just as I turned back to the grill, I felt it, his gaze on me. When I met his eyes, he didn't look away. He didn't shift awkwardly or feign distraction. Instead, he held my stare, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips, like he knew something I didn't. Heat crept up my neck. I turned away first. Dinner passed in easy conversation, mostly between Jake and Nick, while I contributed only when necessary. I was too aware of Nick's voice, the way it wrapped around words like they were meant just for him. When Jake excused himself to take a call, Nick and I were left alone. He stretched, his shirt riding up just enough to expose the sharp lines of his abdomen. I looked away too quickly, and he noticed. Of course he noticed. "So, Callahan," he said, his tone light but laced with something I couldn't quite define. "Jake's told me a lot about you. Good things, I hope." A slow grin. "Mostly." He swirled the ice in his drink, eyes never leaving mine. "You don't talk much, do you?" "Not unless I have something worth saying." His smile deepened. "I like that." I exhaled through my nose, forcing a chuckle. "You're a confident one, aren't you?" He shrugged. "I know when someone's looking at me." The words landed like a punch, even though they were delivered with the softest touch. My grip on my glass tightened. "I don't know what you mean," I said evenly. Nick leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I think you do." My pulse pounded in my ears. I searched for something, anything, to say that would break whatever was happening between us. Then Jake's voice cut through the air, calling Nick back inside. The moment shattered. Nick stood, pausing just long enough to shoot me one last, knowing look before following Jake. I sat in silence, my heart hammering against my ribs, the weight of something forbidden settling over me like a heavy storm cloud. This summer was going to be dangerous. The house had settled into its usual nighttime quiet, except tonight, it wasn't peaceful. It was restless. I sat in the dimly lit living room, a half-finished whiskey in my hand, listening to the faint murmur of crickets outside. Jake had gone to bed an hour ago. Nick, though, was still awake. I could feel it. I didn't know how or why, but I knew. The kitchen light flicked on. I turned my head slightly and found him standing in the doorway, his silhouette sharp against the glow behind him. Loose sweatpants. No shirt. Barefoot. Nick smirked when he saw me. Couldn't sleep. Something like that. He walked in like he owned the place, grabbing a glass from the cabinet. Whiskey. I hesitated. He glanced over his shoulder, his smirk deepening. Come on, Callahan. We're both adults here. That was the problem. Still, I poured him a glass, watching as he took the seat across from me. He leaned back, completely at ease, fingers tracing the rim of his drink. You always this quiet? He asked. You always this forward? His grin was slow, deliberate. When I see something I want. The words settled between us, heavy and undeniable. I cleared my throat, shifting in my chair. Jake mentioned you're studying architecture. Nick took a sip, amused. We're really doing small talk? I exhaled through my nose, gripping my glass tighter. What do you want me to say? Nick tilted his head, considering me. Then, he leaned forward, forearms resting on his knees. The shift in posture brought him inches closer. Close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. I think you already know what I want. Heat coiled low in my stomach. Dangerous. This was dangerous. I forced myself to look away, taking a slow drink. Go to bed, Nick. For a moment, he didn't move. I could feel his gaze on me, weighing, testing. Then, finally, he stood, stretching lazily before heading for the stairs. At the last step, he paused. Turn. I like talking to you, Callahan, he murmured. Then he disappeared, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt hunted. The next day was a slow torment. Jake suggested we go for a swim. I hesitated at first but agreed, hoping that keeping things normal would smother whatever had sparked the night before. But Nick wasn't interested in normal. He moved through the water effortlessly, every motion slow and deliberate. The sun glistened on his wet skin, each drop of water tracing down his body with infuriating precision. I tried not to look. I failed. At one point, Nick leaned against the edge of the pool, arms spread wide, chest rising and falling with deep, even breath. He caught me watching. He smiled. I turned away, swimming to the deeper end, putting space between us. But space meant nothing when he was already under my skin. Later, as I dried off on the patio, Sarah called. A routine check-in, another forced conversation. I barely heard her, because Nick was still watching me. That night, it happened again. I stepped outside for air, the night breeze doing little to cool the heat simmering beneath my skin. Footsteps behind me. I didn't turn. I didn't have to. Nick stopped beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. You keep running, he said softly. I exhaled, gripping the railing. You're imagining things. Nick let out a quiet laugh, deep and knowing. You want me to stop? He asked. I should have said yes. Instead, I said nothing. The silence stretched, thick with everything we weren't saying. Then, he did something reckless. He reached out, his fingers brushing my hand. The touch was barely there, but it was enough. A sharp inhale. A tightening of my jaw. Nick. He didn't pull away. Neither did I. He leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. Say it. I turned my head slightly, our faces inches apart. His breath was warm against my skin, his lips parted, waiting. I was going to kiss him. I was going to ruin everything. A noise from inside, Jake moving in his room. We broke apart. Nick exhaled a quiet laugh, shaking his head as he backed away. Not yet, huh? He didn't wait for an answer. I watched him disappear into the house, my pulse hammering against my ribs. I had crossed the line, whether I wanted to admit it or not. And now there was no turning back. The house was heavy with silence. Not the peaceful kind. Not the kind that settled like a soft lull at the end of a long day. No, this silence buzzed. It was thick, electric, pressing into every corner of the room like a presence of its own. Jake had gone out for the night. He'd invited Nick along, but Nick declined. Said he was tired. He lied. And I knew he lied. Because he was still here. And so was I. I found him in the living room, sprawled lazily on the couch, a glass of whiskey in hand. The dim glow of the lamp cast shadows across his sharp features, making him look even more untouchable. Except, I wanted to touch him. Nick glanced up when I entered, that familiar smirk already tugging at his lips. Callahan. His voice was slow, knowing. Like he had all the time in the world. I swallowed hard, ignoring the way my pulse kicked up. Drinking alone? He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, eyes locked onto mine. Didn't feel like going out. You should've. He let out a quiet chuckle. You don't mean that. I exhaled sharply, running a hand over my face. Nick. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Why do you keep fighting this? His words landed like a challenge. A direct hit to the part of me that had been unraveling since the moment he stepped through my front door. I had no answer. Or maybe I did, but I was too afraid to say it. Nick took a slow sip of whiskey, watching me with something unreadable in his eyes. Then, without breaking eye contact, he set his glass down and stood. The space between us disappeared. His scent wrapped around me, warm, intoxicating. I should have stepped back. I didn't. You can still walk away, he murmured. I couldn't. Not anymore. The moment shattered when Nick reached up and touched me. A light brush of fingers against my jaw, tracing down, lingering at my throat. My breath hitched. My body betrayed me, leaning into the touch before my mind could stop it. He saw it. And he smiled. That cocky, knowing smirk that made something inside me snap. Before I could think, before I could talk myself out of it, I grabbed him. A fistful of his shirt. A sharp intake of breath. His eyes darkened, but he didn't pull away. If anything, he stepped closer. His lips hovered near mine, barely an inch apart. Waiting. Tell me to stop, he whispered. I should have. Instead, I crushed my mouth to his. Fire. That's what it felt like something I had buried for too long had finally ignited. Nick groaned against my lips, his hands gripping my waist, pulling me closer. The couch was behind us, but we didn't make it that far. We stumbled, his back hitting the wall with a soft thud, his breath hitching as I pressed against him. My hands traced the hard lines of his body, fingers digging into warm skin, memorizing the way he fit against me. It was reckless. It was wrong. And I didn't care. Not in that moment. Not when I had spent weeks drowning in restraint, in denial. Nick's fingers slid under my shirt, his touch searing. His lips moved from my mouth to my jaw, down my neck, leaving a trail of heat in their wake. I let out a sharp breath, my grip tightening on him. Then, the front door creaked open. Jake. We broke apart so fast, I nearly lost my balance. Nick's chest rose and fell rapidly, his lips still red from our kiss, his pupils blown wide. I took a step back. Then another. I couldn't breathe. Jake called out from the hallway, keys jangling in his hand. Hey, Dad? You still up? Nick and I locked eyes. Everything had just changed. And there was no going back. Jake's voice echoed down the hall. Dad. Nick and I stood frozen, breathless, the weight of what had just happened still hanging between us like an electric charge in the air. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his lips still parted, still swollen from our kiss. I took another step back, my pulse a hammering force against my ribs. Jake's footsteps grew louder, coming closer. Nick's gaze stayed locked on mine, a silent challenge in his eyes. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't scrambling to fix what we had done. Because he didn't regret it. I did. Or at least, I was supposed to. I ran a hand through my hair, forcing myself to move, to act normal. To bury the moment we had just shared deep enough that Jake would never have a reason to dig it up. Jake rounded the corner, his face lit up from the glow of his phone's screen. Didn't think you'd still be awake. I swallowed hard, my voice rough when I finally spoke. Couldn't sleep. Jake glanced between us, his brows pulling together slightly. Everything okay? Nick smirked, casual as ever. Unbothered. Untouched. Yeah, he said smoothly, stretching his arms over his head like nothing had happened. Your dad was just giving me a hard time about skipping out tonight. Jake scoffed, dropping onto the couch beside him. Dude, you missed a hell of a night. Nick shot me a glance. Yeah, he murmured. I had a feeling I would. I turned away, walking toward the kitchen before Jake could see the storm on my face. I needed air. The next morning, everything was wrong. Jake was oblivious, shoving cereal into his mouth, scrolling through his phone. Nick, on the other hand, was anything but oblivious. He leaned against the counter, nursing a cup of coffee, watching me with that same unreadable expression. Waiting. Taunting. I avoided his eyes, forcing myself to focus on my own cup, the heat of it scalding against my palms. I barely tasted it. I was still reeling. From the night before. From the way I had lost control. From the fact that I wanted to lose it again. Jake glanced at Nick. You up for hitting the gym later? Nick's smirk deepened. I think your dad already gave me a workout last night. I choked on my coffee. Jake frowned. What? Nick just sipped his drink, gaze flicking to me, daring me to react. I didn't. I couldn't. By midday, I had given up pretending. I found Nick in the backyard, sitting on the patio steps, arms resting casually on his knees. He didn't look surprised when I approached. I can't do this, I said, my voice low, firm. Nick tilted his head, considering me. You already did. I gritted my teeth. It was a mistake. He chuckled. Didn't feel like one. I clenched my fist. Nick. He stood, stepping close, too close. Always too close. You're lying to yourself, he murmured. I exhaled sharply. This is wrong. Why? He challenged. I stared at him, searching for something to say, something that would break whatever hold he had over me. But I came up empty. Nick's expression softened, but his voice stayed firm. You're miserable, Callahan. I see it. I see the way you go through the motions, the way you keep yourself locked away. You think I don't notice? I swallowed, my throat tight. Tell me you don't want this, he whispered. Say it and I'll stop. I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. Nick's lips curved into a knowing smile. He reached up, fingers grazing my jaw, tilting my face toward him. The heat of his touch burned through me, unraveling everything I had fought so hard to keep together. I inhaled shakily, my resolve crumbling. But before I could speak, before I could fall apart completely, Jake's voice cut through the air. Hey Nick, you seen my? Nick stepped back just as Jake came outside. Jake's eyes flicked between us. Everything good? Nick turned away first, shoving his hands in his pockets. Yeah, he said. Everything's fine. Jake nodded, oblivious. Cool. I need a ride into town later. I didn't hear the rest. Because Nick was already walking away. And something inside me knew that if I let him leave now, I'd never get this moment back. But maybe that was for the best. Maybe some things weren't meant to be undone.